The Wealthy Barber. Now, this book came out in 1989, and it became one of the biggest-selling books in Canadian history. Sold more than 2 million copies. Now, who is the man behind it? Well, his name is David Chilton. He was born in Kitchener, Ontario, and early on in his life, he was fascinated with business and economics. I suspect, though, that it went beyond putting money in a piggy bank. So, with those interests, he went to school. He actually went to Laurier University, got himself a degree in finance, and worked as a stockbroker for a couple of years. But when he was 25 years old, Dave decided to write a book on financial planning. And remember, back then, there weren't a whole lot of books written about this subject, certainly not the way he wanted to do it. He did it by writing it as a novel. The book was called The Wealthy Barber, and that was also the main character of the book. And in it, the wealthy barber taught his customers how to get rich slowly, which you may recall in the 80s, it was all about getting rich quick. He also taught him how to stay that way, and he did it with basic economics.
But I think if you were to set aside 15 to 20% of your income, especially on a pre-tax basis, you'd be in excellent shape as you head toward retirement.
With that message, he caught on, and Dave has become a public speaker. He has also stayed in the book business, but he's changed his focus from finance to food. He's helped publish a couple of low-fat cookbooks, Looney Spoons and Eat, Shrink, and Be Merry, both, by the way, national bestsellers. Everybody, please say hello to David Chilton. Morning, man. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
A real pleasure. I know you don't do a lot of television, so we appreciate you coming on the program.
My pleasure.
It's very cool. I remember I was working as when I was going through college, I was working at a bookstore at the airport, Terminal 2, and in Toronto, and this book was flying off the shelves, The Wealthy Barber. It was this and Grisham at the same time. But what I noticed about this was it was almost like when the iPod first came out, there were a whole bunch of guys in business suits who would they wanted to talk to me. Have you talked to me about this book? It was as if they had read some sort of spiritual
I like
thing.
that.
Yeah, well, you should.
Yeah,
you sold the book, right?
I know, it's so strange. I had one good idea in my life. My whole life, one good idea. So thank God I had it when I was young.
But you were a kid when you wrote that book.
I was 25 when I sat down to write the book. And I tried to take the conventional wisdom and repackage it and make it more accessible. But I never thought it would become what it did. I wanted to sell 10,000. That was the goal. In fact, I tell this story often, but 3 months after its release, my grandmother phoned one night and bought 12 copies. And my wife and I were so excited we were high-fiving each other. That was the biggest order we'd ever had. We packed up the books and we shipped them off. We invoiced her in full, no discounts for grandmas. Nice. And that was how the whole thing started. And it really didn't do that well the first year, interestingly. It kind of plodded along, but year 2 it just took off, and I think now it's up to about 3 million and keeps going. So it's been a dream come true. My father said I peaked at way too young an age, and he's probably right, but I don't care. I'm happy to have had it happen.
Dude, you self-published the book, which means you probably kept most of the money, so who cares?
I did. I gave it to Stoddard Publishing partway through because I got so busy with speaking, but I got it back when they went bankrupt. Hate to prosper off somebody else's demise, but I'm not above it.
Right.
And so I took it back. But yeah, the self-publishing part ended up being a very lucrative end of it.
You know, when I first I was working that and I went through the book, I remember thinking it was advice that my grandmother and my mother used to give me, which was, well, save your money and don't get into debt.
That's all what it's all about. And hey, is that good for right now? I mean, we've had a society live beyond its mean for 20 years, and the government level, the individual level, people want too much stuff.
Yeah.
They want it all. They don't want one large screen, high-definition TV. They want 4. And we just keep spending, spending, spending. So the basics of the book, I think, today apply as well as they ever have.
What do you do? I mean, Barack Obama just said it the other day that for, like it or not, that credit is an important part of society, our society. And how does one navigate through a world when credit is just so integral?
Well, it's a good question because we do prosper because of credit. It's that availability to borrow and invest at a better rate of return that's led to all this development and growth in the last 200 years. The problem is we went too far. Our leverage rates were through the roof. And again, look at the American government right now. People love to talk about complex microeconomics. How are they going to get out of this? And macro philosophies. Forget that. It's basic grade 3 arithmetic. They are in huge trouble. They've got $42 trillion in unfunded liabilities. They've got huge deficits, huge debt. You have to use credit responsibly. You can't have everything you want. I don't care if you're John Smith living on 4th Ave in Kitchener or if you're the U.S. government. So we've got to restrain a little bit, but that retrenchment's going to take years. It's a tough time right now. It is not fun. It's going to be a slow growth period and maybe even worse, maybe even negative growth for a while. You know, for us as an individual, when things start to fall apart in our life, we can just sell everything we have on Craigslist and then try to get through. And the American government would have a hell of a sale. But how does one, because I want to come back after the break and talk on a personal level, but we rely on our governments and our country to sort of take care of us on a macro level. Right.
How do they get out of this?
Well, governments can't solve the problems, I think, the way people are hoping they can. In fact, it was interesting yesterday when Geithner spoke and the market collapsed after a speech. It's because nothing he said could have soothed them. As soon as they listened to it, they thought, that's not going to fix things quickly. Nothing is going to fix this quickly. It's going to take a decade, 12, 15 years to kind of work our way through all the excess leverage we had, and it's going to take, again, that consumer retrenchment. But we've got, back to Keynes's paradox of thrift, when we all start saving and spending less, that slows the economy even more. So it is going to be a very challenging time. I'm moving back with my mom and dad. I think that's the, yeah, absolutely. My mom still does my laundry, so I might as well.
Does she really?
She does it a lot, and you know, a lot of people would be embarrassed by that. I'm not at all. That's the funny thing. I think it gives her a reason to be.
But it's probably, well, it does. No, hey,
you know what I mean?
It
like
gives her
76, and I've never seen a healthier, happier, more high-energy person, and I think it's because she's always doing errands for me.
How
like,
disgusting is your laundry that it's going to give her that much meaning?
A lot, yeah, a lot. So no, she's very happy. She wanted to come tonight, by the way. She's a huge fan of yours.
You should have brought her,
she's watching
man.
right now. Yes, I should have brought her.
Hi.
But she was busy doing the laundry. I couldn't free up the time. Yeah,
Listen, next time you come with me, and I'll bring my laundry too. And that'll be all right.
A lot of black shirts. We both wear a lot of black shirts.
There you go. Okay, good. Your mom does the black swell?
Yes.
That's very good. So does my mom. Right, stick around. When we come back, the question isn't about government so much as what David can bring to our life. What can you do with what you have in terms of money and savings? More with David Chilton when we come back. Former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney is also going to be on the program on Thursday, and the only guy to be a bigger star that day than Brian Mulroney, also on the show, Rick Mercer will be here. So Mercer, Mulroney, and Mandel, and more, all next week on the show. And Lily Allen, which will be good. David Chilton is here. When this book was selling, when I worked at the bookstore, we sold a ton of copies from our location, and that was a big store for you, wasn't it?
Huge. And I used to go in there all the time before I got into flight. They never believed that I wrote the book.
I had really long hair. You wouldn't have
recognized.
Yeah,
no, I remember you.
I looked like Alanis Morissette,
you had some
not
issues.
cute.
You had some. You kept trying to push erotic at me, and I thought that was weird, but that's fine. You know? And I remember going in there a lot saying, I'll sign the books while I'm here. And they would say, well, why would you do that? They never thought that I could be the guy that wrote The Wealthy Barber. I just don't have the look. And I would argue with them. And at one point, I argued with the lady over and over again, saying, I wrote that book. And finally, at one point, she said, no, you didn't. I read it. That doesn't even make sense. So I gave up and walked away.
When did you get a sense that the market was going to collapse?
2.5 years ago, I went to Naples, Florida with a buddy of mine who owns Mako Canada. And we saw what was happening down there with everybody buying real estate with nothing down. Now, I had no idea it would spread to the credit crisis. Right. And with all the exotic vehicles out there, the derivatives, all this would happen. But you could see the real estate market was poised to burst and go down dramatically, and that would lead to other problems. I mean, it really did get frightening out there. People borrowing money with no income, no assets behind them. It was craziness. In fact, we'll look back on this 20 and 30 years from now when the details emerge and go, how could that possibly have happened? I mean, it's pretty scary.
Will we learn, will there be regulation in place now that sort of protects us from ourselves?
I think there will be, and I think they'll also make a lot of changes where the people who originate the loan, the actual lender, has to hold on to the risk. They can't package it and send the risk elsewhere, because that's where the system starts breaking down.
You know, a lot of this book talks about how you can plan for the proper retirement, and I suspect that a lot of it still holds true. But what happens if you're 60 years old today? You're 60, and you thought there was a retirement plan, and that's gone. People watching who are maybe 55 now, there is a legitimate fear that their retirement years are going to be spent wiping tables at a restaurant, just trying to get by.
No, it's tough, and you know, it's interesting. Coming back into financial planning about 4 or 5 years ago, the two things that jumped to me: one, how many people were abusing lines of credit and had taken on huge lines of credit and almost treated them like a big credit card. But the second was how aggressive older investors had become. When I left the business 10 and 12 years ago, the older investor at 55, 60, 65 had most of their money in conservative vehicles and would put some in stocks because, of course, over very long stretches, stocks perform well. But boy, had they ever moved over. They were 75 and 80% invested in stocks. So when you have this kind of calamity, they don't have the luxury of being patient. And now they're in a very tough position, as you say, and there's no easy answer. I think as long as you can wait the 10 to 12 years, you could be fine. But this is not a fun time. You've got to live within your means. My primary message has always been spend less than you make. And I think, by the way, you're just as happy when you do. All of the material possessions we've taken on, I really don't think have added much to people's happens.
Except for the PS3.
And the PS3 you got to have. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not into, it takes too much work.
But look at the size of people's houses now.
I know.
I mean, people live in 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 square foot homes and have to furnish. I live in 1,300 square feet, no garage.
Really?
Which is really silly. You got to have a garage. That was a mistake. This year it's been a big. I don't have a garage. I do. I live in a very small house. But you know, I live in 1,300 square feet. I have a room I don't even go in. That's the point. You know, we live in too big of homes. We spend too much money. We really do.
Are you a Buddhist? Like, what do you do?
No, I mean, honestly, I don't even find the house that small. I really don't. No, my mom can still get over and get the stuff and get out. There's no issues whatsoever.
If you're 40 years old right now and you know you're making okay living, you're getting by, what do you do? What do you do with your money?
Well, I think you always pay off debt. You hammer away at debt. It's not just a good mathematical after-tax rate of return, but it reduces stress, it frees up cash flow, it builds pride and ownership. There's nothing wrong with going that road. It's nice and secure. Once you've done that, then you use the tax-assisted vehicles, the new tax vehicle the government's just launched, retirement savings plans, invest relatively conservatively, just build on a monthly basis. The old-fashioned tried and true principles still work. The fancy stuff that people have trouble coming to grips with, limited partnerships, options, commodities, derivatives, they don't work. They're ineffective. The good things like paying off debt, slowly building up your money over a 20-year period, that's what people have to go back and focus on. But again, restrain yourself. Live within your means. Don't buy everything you need. You don't have to have everything out there. Have some nice things, but not everything.
It's almost as if, for somebody at home, I'm 36 years old and I was too young to invest or even make money in the 80s, aside from a paper route, but in the 80s sort of gave us the impression that, well, you can do that. You can make lots of money. You can do this. Will that exist again?
I don't think we're going to see the kind of market returns that we saw in the 80s and 90s going forward. I really don't. I think we're going to have subdued growth. The American consumers tapped, and they were really driving the entire world economy. I think we're going to have lower rates of return in the stock markets. We may even have very significant inflation come back at some point with all the printing of currencies going on throughout the world. It could be a very tough investment time over the next 10 to 20 years.
Does the 10% thing still exist, paying yourself?
You absolutely have to save.
And for people who don't know that, tell them what that is.
Well, that's the whole key, I think, is don't budget. Budgeting doesn't work. It looks great in books, sounds great in theory, but in real life, it's invariably sabotaged by human nature. Very few people can budget successfully. Those few who can, they're not fun people. Okay, they're teachers, I always say, okay? So once you get away from budgeting, you have to save. Take the money off the top of the paycheck and dedicate it toward long-term growth. Pay yourself first, old-fashioned and trite, but it's the most important words in all of financial planning.
Pay yourself and then just take the rest and put it away.
Take the rest and spend it. The problem is on the far end now, people are building up lines of credit. So they're saving it on the one end, but then they're borrowing again on the other. You've got to stay away from consumer debt. It's the killer.
You wrote this book. This was your money book, and then you went away from it, and then you published some food books, right?
I published cookbooks.
Right, cookbooks, and which even turned into TV.
Yeah.
So that must have been fun. You're back in the money game. You're writing are you writing it's not a sequel. This started off as a thing of Cheers. Did you watch Cheers?
Yeah, that's exactly where I got the idea. I watched Cheers one night. The original title was The Wealthy Bartender, but I got 4 or 5 chapters in, and all the characters were drunk, and I had prostitutes, and I had guys picking up girls. It was getting so convoluted.
I would have pushed that book on you in the bookstore. Hey, hookers drinking, come on.
It doesn't get any better than that. So I switched it over to the barber shop, and that's how I went. And the second book is not a sequel. I mean, I might use the title because selfishly it'll draw a lot of attention, but I don't think that I will use a story format again.
People pitch you Didn't people pitch you follow-ups all the time?
You wouldn't believe it. I've got 3 different doctors, so these are legitimate pitches, pitching me sex manuals, and they all 3 wanted to call it The Horny Barber.
Fantastic.
All 3. All 3.
The first time I ever saw Playboy was in a barber shop, so they were always on the counter.
But not the last time.
Not the last time. How do you know? The book is called The Wealthy Barber. Get yourself a copy. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming,
thank you very much for having me.
David Chilton. All right, up next, Canada's great comic. The next one, John Doerr. I remember I was working as when I was going through college, I was working at a bookstore at the airport, Terminal 2, and in Toronto, and this book was flying off the shelves, The Wealthy Barber. It was this and Grisham at the same time. But what I noticed about this was it was almost like when the iPod first came out, there were a whole bunch of guys in business suits who they wanted to talk to me. Have you talked to me about this book? It was as if they had read some sort of spiritual
I like
thing.
that.
Yeah, well, you should.
Yeah,
you sold the book, right?
I know, it's so strange. I had one
stayed in the book business, but he's changed his focus from finance to food. He's helped publish a couple of low-fat cookbooks, Looney Spoons and Eat, Shrink, and Be Merry, both, by the way, national bestsellers. Everybody, please say hello to David Chilton. Morning, man. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
A real pleasure. I know you don't do a lot of television, so we appreciate you coming on the program.
My pleasure.
It's very cool. The Wealthy Barber. Now, this book came out in 1989, and it became one of the biggest selling books in Canadian history. Sold more than 2 million copies. Now, who is the man behind it? Well, his name is David Chilton. He was born in Kitchener, Ontario, and early on in his life, the book was called The Wealthy Barber, and that was also the main character of the book. And in it, the Wealthy Barber taught his customers how to get rich slowly. Which you may recall, in the 80s, it was all about getting rich quick. He also taught him how to stay that way, and he did it with basic economics.
But I think if you were to set aside 15 to 20% of your income, especially on a pre-tax basis, you'd be in excellent shape as you head toward retirement.
With that message, he caught on, and Dave has become a public speaker. He was fascinated with business and economics. I suspect, though, that it went beyond putting money in a piggy bank. So with those interests, he went to school. He actually went to Laurier University, got himself a degree in finance, and worked as a stockbroker for a couple of years. But when he was 25 years old, Dave decided to write a book on financial planning. And remember, back then, there weren't a whole lot of books written about this subject, certainly not the way he wanted to do it. He did it by writing it as a novel.